Clean out your mouth, this is not what it's for. There's still a blood stain from the spill of the war. Pick up your sorrow, this is not who we are. I won't cry, uncle, having come so far. Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for nobody, with me, Swanji Hai.
And me, I was Jimmy Rhodes, but I've had a haircut, so now no one recognises me.
Well, our listeners, this is going to be... Well, no, it isn't, but they have seen us before. There's one episode they might have seen us. But for those of you that are watching for the first time, and if you're watching to see Jimmy's perm, then the bad news is it's gone. But you're going to have to deal with that.
I'm sure that's exactly why people tuned in this week.
I'm sure it is. So this is the first in a series of China-themed episodes. We are going to be interviewing Kristy Loke a little bit later, but we thought we would set the scene a little bit. I think most listeners probably know myself and Jimmy are based in China, although we've said for many episodes that our knowledge of developments of AI in China is pretty lacking, which is why we've got Kristy on the episode. But I think let's maybe have a bit of a chat about sort of why we wanted to do this series of episodes other than to kind of indulge ourselves and to learn more about AI. I mean, I think fundamentally the first point is, as we've mentioned before, is, you know, we're not here to kind of be a mouthpiece for the Chinese state. But I think as people who live here, what we would like to do is give a kind of more balanced view than what people in countries like the UK and the US, where I think most of our listeners are, will maybe get on China. So, you know, to explain a bit about how China's AI develops, how they regulate AI, the kind of apps that they use, the way in which China is sort of managing the disruption to its development by the restrictions that China has put on chip purchases and development, and just basically how, you know,
the
how
restrictions
China,
that have been put on China.
What did I say?
The restrictions that China's put
on itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, the restrictions the US has put on China. Yeah, I'd correct myself. So those are, I guess,
you, actually.
Well, I'm now correcting myself.
Okay, sorry.
You told me to correct myself, and now I'm doing
now
it.
You're
Do you want the credit? Jimmy corrected me. I was wrong, and Jimmy was right. So yeah, Jimmy, do you want to introduce AI in China? Even though I've just said you don't know anything about it.
Yeah, here he is, or she. No, so I'm in the same boat. I don't know a ton about AI in China. What I do know is that obviously it's a very, in terms, we've talked about guardrails quite a lot on a lot of episodes, and obviously, as you can imagine, guardrails are very different in China.
You're my guardrails, by the way.
Yeah, well, evidently. But yeah, like the guardrails are obviously very different in China, but the sort of method is the same. I think that China's, you know, you'll hear more about this on the episode, but China's obviously working in a fairly constrained environment because of the restrictions that have been placed upon it. But there's still a ton of innovation going on. And I think a lot of that is super interesting. China's, you know, historically, China, I think, has been branded as a country that, in general, kind of copies technology. So they're not necessarily a first mover. But actually, they've proven over the last couple of decades in particular, they've proven to be really good innovators on existing technologies, and actually haven't necessarily been given enough credit for that, I think, where, you know, they've effectively made themselves sole manufacturer for not just, you know, like, you know, fluffy toys and made in China type stuff, but actually really high technology applications, and technology, and I think the same is happening with AI, but on an even more accelerated scale. Like, education's really good in China. There are a lot of really talented people. A lot of them work in the US now, but a lot of them still work in China as well. And you've got these big companies like Alibaba with a lot of clout behind them, that are quickly adopting some of these AI technologies. You've got world-leading models now coming out of China, which people probably don't know about, but things like Quen, which we talk about later on in the episode, which I think actually Quen 2.5 came out just earlier this week, and it's topping the charts in terms of benchmarks. This is an open source model, I think released by Alibaba, which is actually, topping a lot of these benchmarks and competing blow for blow with some of the Western models. So I think it's really important. This is why one of the reasons why I want to do the episode, right, is because we need to pay attention to this. It is really important. It's the second biggest economy in the world, and it is trading blows on AI and AI technology. And actually, in terms of AI governance, again, as we talk about later in the episode, it's up there. It's trading blow for blow. Like there is some real innovation in that space. So I think it's a super interesting episode.
And most people who visit China, particularly who visit it for the first time or who haven't been for a long time, are always kind of blown away by the adoption of technology and the way that, and it's both a good and a bad thing. I mean, the convenience that you have living in China, you sacrifice a lot in terms of privacy, and there are obviously concerns with that. But I think for most people are kind of blown away by how even a sort of elderly person living in a sort of hutong, which is the small alley in Beijing, the city where we are, is using AI, even not knowing it, on a sort of daily basis. It's been integrated as part of people's lives in the way that algorithms run, delivery services, in the way that facial recognition, for its good and bad sides, but facial recognition, there are things where in an airport you can, I think in Dashing Airport in Beijing, you can go up to a counter. So they have these things in the airport. You go up to it and you stand in front of it, and it will tell you where your flight is, whether it's on time. People find that scary. Other people find it to be incredibly convenient. But it's there and it's integrated and it's happening in a way that is not happening in the same way. And I think that's the thing, is like the real world uses in China mean that it's this incredible kind of testing ground for AI applications. And there's a lot of stuff that is called AI that's not. I think that's a really important thing. It's no different from the US or the UK or any other country where people put AI on something as a way to sell it. But I do think it is definitely, for me, the place where you talk about this a lot, about how it's the way AI will become ubiquitous and you won't know the kind of boundary between AI and technology. Well, that's already happened in China, to be honest. That's why I think it is different here to what it is in most of the countries.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like some of the adoption actually is quicker. I've seen applications 3 or 4 years ago. I've seen applications of facial recognition that I hadn't seen anywhere else in the world.
Robot taxis?
Yeah.
Driver. I say robot taxis. Driverless taxis.
Yeah, there's driverless taxis in a few places already, which I think is happening in the US as well. But
it is. I think it's only, like, the US is sort of away and we know it's kind of happening in the US. I'm sure there are other places, but I haven't heard of anywhere where it's adopted in the same kind of scale. I mean, I know there was something in California now that is kind of available, I think almost like not everywhere, but in like many cities. I think there's a form of AI taxis. I know they're even developing helicopter taxis, AI powered self-driven helicopter taxis. Well, they call them helicopter taxis. Maybe drones. The thing that I question about these is the only people who are going to be able to afford to travel in them or going to travel in helicopters are probably quite successful, wealthy people. The people who probably don't want to be traveling in AI-controlled vehicles. So I find it a bit of a kind of...
maybe. But also misnomer. Contradiction. But also, maybe I'm wrong here, but like it feels like if you've got like a drone that can fly around, it's kind of avoids all the problems with AI.
Yeah.
Like, because the main problem that AI controlled cars have is they have to drive around on chaotic roads that are also shared space with cyclists and pedestrians and cars and unpredictable stuff. Feels like actually if you can just take off and go somewhere by drone, then it's probably a lot easier.
The other last example, as we're not listing examples of AI uses in China, but I've mentioned this before, but these robots that you get in hotels now that deliver takeaway deliveries to your room, when I mentioned it a couple of months ago, it was the first time I'd seen it. Since then, every hotel I've stayed in, and it's not like I stay in that many hotels, but I've stayed in 3 or 4 since then, have all had it.
Really?
Yeah, all of them. There was one I stayed in Wuhan a couple of weeks ago. That had it. The one in Penglai has been one in Shanghai I stayed in. They all have these little delivery things. So,
what are you getting delivered in?
Takeaway is delivered.
Oh, like your food?
Yeah, so you get takeaway is delivered downstairs.
Like,
and there used to be these, but yeah, I'm getting a telegram delivered to me. Call your wife. Yeah, they used to have like these, and then they still do have them, but outside like little kind of individual kind of like mailboxes, and they put your takeaway food in there, you get a code and you go and get it out. Now more and more they're coming in, they put it in the robot, and the hotel must give them the room number, and it then goes to the lift, gets in the lift. Obviously it's set with the lift controls, so it takes it up to the floor and it delivers it to him. It's pointless because it's really inconvenient because it takes ages, but you know, it's there.
People won't get this reference, and maybe I've made it before, but it just sounds like the robot in Flight of the Navigator.
Yeah, you made it before.
Okay.
It was a good reference then.
It's a good...
if you haven't listened to that episode, this is a great reference.
It's a great
if
reference,
you have,
yeah. This is
a sign of Jimmy's post-COVID brain fog,
yeah,
which is another reference
to a previous episode. Yeah, and if you're not at least 40, you won't get the reference at all because it's from a film from like 19.
So anyway, moving on. Jimmy, before the interview proper, there were a few terms in the interview that we thought it would be useful. So can you just spend a few minutes introducing our audience to some of those terms?
Yeah, so the reason was this episode, I'll be honest, it is it's a really, really super interesting episode, but it is quite academic. It's very interesting. But there was a few terms that came up during the episode. So just in case you don't understand what these terms mean, or you want to refer back to this, then we had a conversation about alignment. So I think we've talked about alignment on previous episodes, but just to explain, alignment is basically around making sure that AI is aligned to our human values and our human goals. So making sure that when we ask an AI to do something, it understands the context in which we want it to do it, and it aligns itself, broadly speaking, with what we want as our outcome. So that's what alignment means. Accelerationist is one of the other things that came up. So the accelerationist viewpoint is basically we should just go 100% flat out to the best version of AI that we can, and possibly artificial general intelligence as soon as we can. Don't worry, we don't want any governance, we don't want any boundaries. We just want to get there as quickly as possible, and we'll solve the problems as we go along. It's a very, I guess, optimistic viewpoint where the assumption is that AI is going to behave itself and we're going to get the alignment right. Whereas the opposite is, I guess, maybe, I don't know what the opposite's actually called.
Effective altruists is pretty much the opposite. Effective altruists are... I mean, they're not the opposite, but they're the alternative to accelerationists in terms of the kind of AI.
Yeah, in terms of the AI
community.
Yeah, but it's basically we need to take a much more measured approach. We need to make sure that every step of the way we're doing all the checks and balances, and we're not rushing into anything, and we don't accidentally trip over ourselves, that kind of thing.
I just want to say something on accelerationist that I think is quite important. Is part of the accelerationist movement, one of the things is they would say that if you do not accelerate, then because you will miss out on the gains, those gains in themselves will save lives, etc. And therefore it is almost unacceptable not to accelerate, because you're potentially costing lives and you're costing all these gains to humanity by doing it. So it's quite an extreme view, but it's not done on the basis of we don't give a shit, we're just going to pursue it. It's actually still has these kind of values, but the idea is that we have to pursue things as quickly as possible to maximize them. Otherwise, we will lose out, and therefore people will die and people will not see the benefits of it. So, yeah.
None of which they can demonstrate or...
Yeah. And actually, I'm not an accelerationist.
No, I mean, it's all a bit dubious because the premise is not like... the premise is on something that we haven't actually... where we don't know what the outcome is going to be yet. So... but yeah, it's fast versus slow, I guess. Teraflops comes up. So flops is a measure of compute. I don't actually know exactly what it means, but you can go and look it up. teraflops is a lot of them, because tera means, I think it means 10 to the power 9, like billions of them, something like that.
Flop is a lot.
A flop is a lot. A teraflop is a
teraflop. Imagine it as like
load.
a flop, like falling off something, and then a teraflop. That's probably not good.
Has it got anything to do with that?
It's probably a pretty bad one.
I don't know why it's
No, I
called a
don't
flop.
think it has.
Pretty sure it's got nothing to do with that.
No, it's got nothing to do with falling off a diving board. So let's move on.
But teraflops is a lot. Red teaming.
Which just sounds filthy if you don't know what it is.
Red teaming came up. So red teaming is like a cybersecurity thing. Red teaming just means basically testing something to its extreme by
Doing naughty things.
Yeah, doing naughty things, that like using it like so in cybersecurity, red teaming is trying to hack into something, trying to break into something, whereas blue teaming is the opposite. It's trying to defend from an attack. So red teaming quite often is used as a term for like, let's see if we can break it, basically. And then finally, open weights. So we talk about open source a fair bit on the podcast. There's a distinction between open source and open weights in terms of AI models. And this is like, even in the description, this is getting a bit technical, but open weights is basically the most open you can be. So it's actually publishing the inner workings of the AI model, which the difference between that and open source is just like anyone can use it for free. Right, and people can develop on it, but open weights is even more open. And actually, if something's open weights, you can then take it and you can tinker with the model a bit more. You can tinker with the engine a little bit more. Whereas open source just means, here you go, you can download the model, you can use it. Maybe we've got some terms and conditions, but you're free to use it. That was, my phone's gone off anyway, but I think that was all of the...
I thought you were doing that just off the top of your head.
Oh yeah, I was, yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jimmy. That was useful. I think for those who are listening to the episode who don't have a technical knowledge, it will be useful. If you do have a technical knowledge, or you are interested in AI in China or the development of AI in China, I think this is going to be your favorite ever episode. If you're not, and you are more of a beginner to AI, there are, like we say, some terms in here which may be a little bit beyond your normal level of understanding, but I think that's what makes this super interesting. I think it is the longest and the most substantial and the most sort of well rehearsed and well thought out interview that we've done. So I hope people will listen to it all. It's going to be in 2 parts because we covered so much stuff. This is going to be part 1, and then we'll put part 2 out either next week or a couple of weeks later. So we hope you enjoy it.
Not to correct you one more time, but when you said rehearsed, I think you meant researched.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't rehearsed. I mean, I'm pretty sure anyone watching this video or listening to this podcast, if they think we've rehearsed this, then I mean, yeah.
It's not rehearsed.
It was a researched episode. It definitely was not
episode.
a rehearsed episode. So thank you. So we are going to take a couple of minutes to get ourselves ready. I'm going to go and look at myself in the mirror. Jimmy is going to...
I'm already looking at myself in the mirror.
You're looking at yourself in the mirror. I'm going to go look at myself in the mirror and do my kind of psych myself up exercises. Jimmy's going to sit here and do a death stare on the screen for the next few minutes. And we will see you in a minute when we interview Kristy Loke. Welcome to Preparing for AI, the AI podcast for everybody. With your hosts, Jimmy Rhodes and me, Matt Cartwright. We explore the human and social impacts of AI, looking at the impact on jobs, AI and sustainability, and most importantly, the urgent need for safe development of AI, governance and alignment. So here we go. We have a very, very special interview. This is our first episode where we have specifically focused on China, and we have Kristy Loke with us today. So Kristy's background is as an AI researcher. The main focus of her research is avenues for US-China cooperation in managing AI risks, which I think everybody will, I'm sure, find very interesting. The Chinese state's frontier AI ambitions and goals, China's new science and technology innovation-led economic model, and I'm going to let her give a better introduction to the work that she's currently and previously been focused on. So Kristy, welcome. If you can give us a bit of an introduction, and then we'll get into what I think is going to be one of the most interesting and maybe the longest interviews that we've done so far.
Thank you so much, Matt and Jimmy, for having me today. As Matt kindly introduced me, I'm a US and China focus researcher, but mostly focusing on China AI development and how that also flows into its governance, thinking, and decision making, and governance, like cooperation on the U.S. and Chinese front, is always something that is very top of mind to me. So in terms of my background, I spent most of my life in Hong Kong, and then I spent some years also in the UK, and most recently in the US. And yeah, that background really informed my research foci as well. Most recently, I spent some time at GovAI, where I was focused on China AI, really the impact of ChatGPT on Chinese governmental and governmental thinking around innovation, around AGI, and also what the firms have been doing in China.
So what's your prediction for when we're going to hit AGI? Because I've heard that Elon Musk just in the last 24 hours said 2026. So just as a fun starter question then, because I think Elon Musk came out and predicted AGI by 2026, artificial general intelligence. So when do you think we're going to hit AGI?
Yeah, so it's become quite a bit of a loaded term. Some of the legal experts in China have been defining AGI as AI with very broad cognitive capabilities. And I know some of the tech leaders also talk about it in terms of the economic impact, if it's replacing a lot of the jobs and driving a lot of like unprecedented productivity gains, then that's probably the time for AGI. And then some of the, Moonshot and Jupu AI's leaders talk about it in the sense of really it's a vibe. If we get there, we feel it. In that sense, I think it's really hard. 2030 might be possible. I think a way to kind of caution against using too many of these like AI leaders timeline is that they also have a lot to gain in terms of packaging it as something that's happening imminently. I think the conversations around scaling law, like slowing down, and the many things that are happening are also very interesting. That said, I think the amount of money, the amount of talent, the amount of investment in both the compute and the data algorithmic ends are tremendous. And so, yeah, breakthroughs can happen. And maybe scaling can get us a large part of the way there. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any of us go by Elon Musk's timelines because we'd have flying cars by now. But yeah, yeah, you make some really good points. In fact, we've talked about AGI on the podcast quite a lot, and that's one of the most difficult things with it. Not to go off on too much of a tangent, but like even getting a clear definition of AGI is something that is really, really difficult. So I think for me, it's about, when you've got machines that can do most human tasks at a sort of level that humans could without supervision, that kind of thing. But yeah, I think 2030 probably sounds a lot more realistic to me.
Okay, I think Jimmy's right. I think we could end up spending an entire episode talking about not just whether we're going to get there, but like you say, the definition of what AGI is. So I'm gonna start us on with the kind of main interview. So let's start out by setting the scene a bit. So, this is a very broad question, but what does China's AI landscape look like at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's looking really interesting, especially having followed it since, more intensely since the release of ChatGPT. And of course, ChatGPT was also released a month and a bit after the first export controls on semiconductors flowing to China came about from the US side. Sorry, very convoluted. But yeah, so those are two very big events that happen, and a lot has happened in China since. So some of the headline things, I think, in terms of big tech involvement in generative AI stuff, it's also getting more diverse So there's a saying in China called 内卷, which is all these companies like spending a lot of money, mostly doing the same thing, but really it's just like a resource drain in a lot of sense. But that seems to be maturing in some sense slowly. I think it's easy to think about the landscape in a couple of ways, right? So the first way to look at it is like, who are the key players? And within the key players, we can look at big tech players, we can look at the unicorns, the startups. And within these two groups, I think it's interesting to think about them in terms of folks that are more focused on the AGI, more foundational technology, more moving the frontier, ensuring that China is still competitive, globally speaking. And in that sense, I think Jupu AI is unique in its really, like steadfast commitment to the AGI goal. And it's also very committed to following, matching OpenAI's commercialization plans, its ecosystem building around, investing in smaller companies that can use the technology they're building really well and therefore help the diffusion of AI in society. So Jupu is really interesting from that point of view. And then, of course, other startups, other unicorns, like Minimax and Moonshot are also interesting to see, mostly because they have such deep tech background within their founding teams. And then in terms of big tech, I would always highlight Alibaba because, again, it's thinking really deeply and broadly. So it's thinking a lot about using the best product lines that it has, the e-commerce line, the foreign markets that it already has developed over time, and using it to export its models in some sense. And its open source model is always ranked really highly, consistently for the past 9+ months. And so that's, in terms of big tech, I think Ali is always a force to be reckoned with.
So just for, we have mentioned a few times, so QN is the name of the model.
Yeah.
I think we've mentioned on a couple of episodes, Ben Cook, who was on one of the episodes, who I know uses it quite a lot in a kind of, I think I don't know, in personal life, but certainly in a work sense. So I think it's definitely, like you said, one way. If you look at the kind of leaderboards, and I think most people listening to our podcast are probably not people who are obsessed with the leaderboards of AI, but if you look at them, QN's one of the sort of names that you see towards the top of the lists, where I guess for people, if they do look at it and they recognize names like Llama or Mistral or Claude, etc., that's maybe the name that they see that they might be surprised to see. I think you sort of answered. I was going to ask you about what is the kind of equivalent of, I mean, people know we don't dislike OpenAI. I dislike Sam Altman with a passion. So we like to promote other large language models. So we could ask you, what is China's OpenAI? But I guess I'd also like to ask you, what is China's version of Claude? Or what is China's most interesting model? Is it Jupu? Is it Tongyi QN? I mean, what do you think is the most interesting model that people who are listening to this podcast, I guess, might want to go out and find out a little bit more about?
Yeah, I think my kind of personal bias here is I'm usually focused on what are the models that seem, or what are the companies and leadership that seems very, very devoted to this AGI project or this advanced AI, advancing the frontier project. And I think in that sense, Jupu is the one that comes to mind, and it has a GLM-4 as one of its latest models. That would be interesting to follow from that perspective. But another big one is actually coming from 01 AI, Kai-Fu Lee's company. Kai-Fu Lee, as a lot of folks who are interested in China and AI know, used to be the head of Google China and has just like a list of experience in the venture capital as well as tech space in China. And I think, again, I think here he used a lot of the personal networks, and again, foreign platform, there are a lot of listeners in the West that are interested in what he has to say. And they also seem to manage to not be overly focused on AGI or overly focused on being OpenAI as much as how do we make existing models that might not be frontier work really well on the consumer end. So that might mean working harder on inference side, and yeah, hiring a lot of talent that can do that part well. Yeah, so Kai Fu Lee's 01 AI is also interesting. I know Kuai Shou, which is another like video tech company in China, has made a lot of inroads with the video side, and of course ByteDance has a lot of existing advantages on the video side as well. Yeah, and then there's an interesting group that I didn't mention, like a cluster of potential exciting companies is from Tsinghua University cluster. There's a lot of them actually being invested by Jupu AI. And so if you look up Jupu AI's Tsinghua investments, you'll see a lot of the interesting companies. And one of them recreated a version of Sora that worked pretty well.
Wow, yeah. So, and it does feel like, I mean, we've talked about it, like, it feels like that's an area where there's massive gains still to be made. So like you talk about some of the efficiencies that can be made through inference and some of like, I think, just generally how can models be like run more efficiently, more cheaply, like less resource intensive. I think that's definitely an area that is a big area of focus right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. People used to talk about, well, people still talk about the scaling law, and the scaling law really is about the predictable trends and kind of like predictable observation, where if you increase the compute data size, model size, then you get very predictable increase in capability and performances of the model. And people are now talking about that for inference, which is essentially getting the models to think more before they generate results. So that's an interesting area that a lot of people are saying is underdeveloped and therefore has a lot to be improved on. And yeah.
So just for the benefit of our listeners, so just to explain that a little bit, like the latest ChatGPT model, 01 preview, I think, and there's obviously a more powerful 01 model which GPT have internally and possibly share with some of their business customers. But this is where they allow the model to actually kind of think and spend a bit more time thinking about the problem after the problem's been asked before responding, rather than just almost responding instantaneously, right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. Yeah, so and I'll admit that's my feeling. I mean, just one more point on this, I guess. Like, do you think that by being the first mover in a way, like OpenAI and ChatGPT, like all the money they're spending, I know they're doing another funding round right now, and it's going to be like $100 billion or $100 billion valuation. Do you think that maybe they've kind of like they've shot out in front, but actually there's a bit of a disadvantage there because they're spending all this money and investing all this resource, where actually some of the efficiencies we're talking about are being realized further down the line?
Yeah, so the question of first mover disadvantage in some sense is interesting. I can mostly base this on like the stuff that I've read in Chinese, right? So for example, my sense is that if you read through some of the interviews with Jupu CEO Zhang Peng, and tech leaders in general, like nobody dares underestimate OpenAI, and I think part of the belief is that it's still got a lot of technical like secret sauce, like that it hasn't fully released. It might not be the next model, but it might just be techniques and theoretical approaches that are pretty cool and pretty useful. And so I think for them, it's almost like they're advancing the field in many ways, and they sometimes decide on like when to reveal those, because once they do, folks do try to match those, be it Q star or something else. And so yeah, not to be underestimated, and there's an internal calculation, right? Like according to what I've read, at least from the Chinese end, is that they need to figure that out. Sorry, is that gibberish?
No. And we should say like OpenAI as well. I mean, there was the recent where Anthropic's Claude, the computer, where it's able to control the computer, and they are basically I don't know if it's out yet or imminently releasing something which is essentially a copy of that. So that to me would suggest, although I think it's not necessarily like you still want to be out at the front, but that idea of being the leader, that there is, it's not so much as a disadvantage, but you are definitely, in terms of the R&D work, you're doing the work for others, aren't you? Which is kind of where also I think the kind of open source and closed source models thing comes in, that if you put the open source model out there, people will kind of help do that development for you. If you've got the closed model and then you're doing all of the development, and then you might find out that actually you're not as far ahead as you think. But I digress a little bit. I wanted to ask you a kind of follow-up around whether you think that China is closing the gap at all on these sort of the best frontier models at the moment, or whether they are behind and you think they will always be behind.
Right. I think the progress has been steady, and I think the indicator of China has caught up in some serious way for myself personally. Again, looking at this, like tracking from the period of late 2022 onwards, I think it's really like beginning of this year. So Jupu was able to release GLM4, and it said that it was able to match most of GPT-4 and maybe surpassing it in some ways, in some areas. And I think we touched on this like very briefly, maybe from what Matt was saying earlier. Benchmarking is hard, and even the best benchmarks might not be the best kind of assessment of whether a model is useful and maximally productivity helpful. And in this sense, I think like they would admit, right? Like Chinese leaders, Chinese tech leaders, and Chinese academic leaders would admit that benchmarking has been a problematic thing, especially in China as well. It's hard for companies who are struggling to survive and trying to, kind of get the next funding to kind of not game the system. And this happens in the West as well, right? But maybe happen to a larger extent. And so I find it really hard to figure out like how good the models are just from tracking the Chinese benchmarks. But with GLM4 at the beginning of this year, it became like publicly recognized and also globally recognized to be getting there on par with GPT-4. But of course, what happened is that the iteration cycle also slows down in the West, right? So between each of the models. And so that might have given Chinese companies like a time to kind of bridge that gap. What's really interesting next is there's so many things, right? Like, will OpenAI and will similar companies be able to overcome some of the slowing benefits of the scaling law and continue to build as quickly as they have been? But that's not really in question. It's just, it's just relatively how fast are they going to be moving? Whereas for China, a big part of a big thing that's going to define how its AI trajectory looks like is the semiconductor export controls and the implications for it domestically. And I think a lot of things are up in the air. I think the best person to follow there is Paul Triolo. He wrote multiple pieces on the semiconductor side of thing. My understanding is that China's making steady progress. But the fundamental question is, it's an organizational question. How do you organize your country? How do you organize different companies to work together so that they can break through certain choke points? It's really hard. And fundamentally, what they're racing against is time, right? So this semiconductor supply chain that we see nowadays that are so sophisticated and so globalized, it really is built on the back of extremely good leadership, extremely great teams that competed with each other very intensely for 3+ decades. And for China to build that internally, it's really hard. And so some of the conversations that are being had is how do you ensure that as these companies are cooperating, perhaps partially like the Semitech model in the US, how do they both compete and collaborate at the same time? When do you introduce more competition within this framework? And one of the trends, it seems like, is that firms are leading the charge. Really competent firms are leading the charge of organizing and connecting some of these supply chain dots within China for indigenization. So one big name and one big player, if not the biggest player that comes to mind, is Huawei. And yeah, whether it's able to lead China to break through the EUV, the EUV kind of checkpoint is a really big thing to watch, but it will likely take time. What I'm interested in following is actually how well is the government organizing itself in support of these commercial players. Yeah.
So you talked a couple of times now already about the sort of semiconductor and chip export controls, and you talked about how that kind of aligned with ChatGPT, whether that's coincidental or not. But how much are they actually slowing down the development of models? Or, and again, I know you kind of touched on this area, but I have read stuff recently about how there is I guess from the US point of view, a risk that by completely throttling those exports, you're just driving innovation in China in such a way as which they may stumble upon something which is much better than even what the US has currently got. And so is it slowing down the development? I know it is at the moment, but do you think there is the potential there that actually those exports controls kind of drive a level of innovation in China that could potentially for them be a really good thing? It's not to necessarily say that it will revolutionize and they will just jump off ahead, but it brings them back into the race, or potentially it gives them something that we can't kind of expect or predict at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one part of the side effects of the blunt tool of export controls, right? So you do see some arguments in China, for example, that might be justified, which is it's really hard to get Chinese firms to not use the most advanced GPUs to build their most competitive and advanced model. And what the export controls have done is essentially made the calculation easier for them. If they're going to lose access to those chips 2, 3, or 1 year down the road, they might as well start figuring out how to do heterogeneous computing, right? Like how to mix Chinese-made or partially Chinese-made chips with these advanced U.S.-made or foreign-made chips to still make the model training work. And so they're building that experience, and they're really adapting to this new reality. And I think what's interesting that could be positive out of this very, very daunting challenge, I think, for China, is that it can make use of its market. It can make use of its semiconductor sector that's always been interested in doing this, but find themselves finding it hard to sell to the domestic market, or always like partially giving up, like in terms of like different parts of the nodes, because there's a better foreign alternative now that they know they won't have it reliably. So yeah, it does help in that sense. But I think it's still taking a lot of the energy and I think governmental focus to fix this problem, because they do see it as a technological security issue, which flows into a national security issue, to not have access to such a powerful technology that underpins a lot of the technological, economic, and political goals that they have ultimately. So we talk about common prosperity. We talk about like the century of like great rejuvenation of China, and it kind of threatens that in a few ways. Yeah.
So how has the government responded? I say the government, I mean the Chinese Communist Party. How has the Chinese Communist Party actually responded? Like what are they actually doing? Because obviously, a lot of this in China will be dictated, and we'll go on to some of this stuff a bit later, but what are they currently doing? What is their particular push, or what are they encouraging in terms of investment? Are they just throwing money at the domestic chip development market? Is that the way that they're doing it? Are they trying to work out where to do it? Is it investment in R&D through the likes of Tsinghua and Beida, things like that? Like, what is their response to those export controls and to the restrictions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think a lot of the Western analysis I've read, followed, are really focused on the node to node, right? Like how are they shrinking? How are they able to reach a 7 nm target, or how are they able to use the big fund, which is like China Semiconductor Fund that spends billions of dollars to support the industry? I think those are perhaps interesting, but those are a little bit outdated in some sense because I think the government thinks about this very systematically and perhaps pragmatically, and they're thinking really like more long term. So some sayings that we've heard in the past, like when Dao Chao Che, like ways to leapfrog in technology so ways to leapfrog in core technologies and catch up with the West. You don't hear that anymore. Instead, you hear a phrase called new whole of nation system a lot, and 新型举国体制, which is really about how do we change the government's role in innovation, as well as how do we ensure that innovative entities, including academia, research organizations, and these leading firms, how do we ensure that they work maximally well together? How do we make sure that they're connecting? So one really interesting frame that they use is the Jupu or the SMIC, the Huawei. These companies would really be asking the questions. And effectively, hopefully, the academia and the research organizations will be answering some of these questions. And ultimately, the answer to these questions will be tested within the market. And through, the free kind of like free hand of like the market economy, we therefore know whether this innovation is valuable and whether it's competitive. And if it's not, then the cycle kind of continues again, and less competitive companies will just not be, doing as much of this, I guess. And so I think this is really interesting. Essentially, they're gesturing towards how do we support the private innovative entities to do their job. And some of the changes are underway, right? Like how do we standardize market like regulations across the country? How do we lower the barrier of entry to these sectors for smaller companies? So yeah, it's very, very systemic in some sense. And I think the chip, what happened with the semiconductor export controls also kind of informed the formation of the Central S&T Commission, which is directly under the central government, and it oversees some of the key S&T strategic decisions. And I think, of course, like chip indigenization is a key part of that. It's an interesting mix of strengthening central control, but also making sure that private companies can do their job well and can find themselves in an ecosystem where everyone is, in the role that they should be. Yeah.
Do you think that, so I know that, this is something that's kind of cropped up, which is that neural processing units, which is, so you've got your graphics processing units, you've got your central processing units, now you've got your neural processing units, which can be used for inference. How much of an impact do you think that will have? Because those are actually kind of new to everybody, even all the chip manufacturers. Is that somewhere where China can get a bit of maybe not necessarily an advantage, but isn't starting from quite as far back?
Up
yeah,
level at least.
Are
you talking about neuromorphic chips?
So like MPUs, so chips that are specifically designed for inference, because whereas you have to do
Grok with a Q.
Yeah, Grok with a Q, Cerberus as well.
Stuff, yeah.
Cerberus as well. So like where you've got NVIDIA who design graphics processing units, and they are used for all of the training. So like all the training data, all of the like when you're training ChatGPT, all the billions of dollars you spend on training, that's using GPUs. But NPUs are like this kind of relatively new thing, which are specifically designed for inference and for doing that really fast, because you can tune these chips to do that.
And we need to know the answer, because if this is the case, we need to pull all of our money out of NVIDIA, because we put all of AI profits into NVIDIA stock, right?
Yeah.
And do we move into Grok instead? That's the question.
Grok or Cerberus.
So
yeah.
Inference is important, right? But it accounts for only 30%, I think, of the compute used for training a model, making a model work. So I agree that there's a lot that can be done on the inference side that got everyone very interested, and I'm sure VCs are investing in that, and these big tech companies are also investing in that. But the other side really matters, right? Like if you're trying to train a frontier model, then you still have to have the necessary compute to be in the game. But yeah, essentially we're in a place where we're squeezing all the efficiency margins of each side of the model training and model serving process. But yeah, and in terms of China investing in like more next gen stuff, like kind of getting a little bit more ahead of the curve than most. It's always been, it's for a long time. It's been interested in like photonics and neuromorphic AI, and Kai Fu Lee's been talking a lot about the inference side of things. So I think they're very, very caught up with what is the frontier that people are chasing, and they're also investing in that. So I wouldn't be shocked if there are quite a few companies doing that in China.
I want to move us a little bit off kind of topic and off the kind of general basis for the interview, and just visit how China or how Chinese people use AI applications, because I'm thinking in terms of listeners to this podcast who probably most of them, maybe on this episode we'll have a load of people who are specifically interested in China, but I think for most of them, as we discussed before we did the podcast, China's quite a kind of strange and mysterious idea still, and I'd like to think that this episode will be a kind of opening of the eyes on how or where China is in terms of development, the innovation that you see in China. But I think one of the questions that they're all going to ask is, like, what do Chinese citizens use AI apps for? Like, how do they use it? Is it the same as in the West? I mean, what are the main use cases? I know you're not in China, and it's maybe a bit weird. We are in China, and we're asking you this question, and you're not in China, but you're an expert on China. We like to think so. What do you think, from your knowledge, are the sort of main use cases? Is it the same? It's just that they're using, Tongyi and whatever, whichever of the Chinese apps they want to use, but actually they're just using it in the same way as ChatGPT? Are there different uses? Is it video is the most important? Is it music? Because obviously the social media sort of growth in China happened in a very different way. Is that similar with apps, or is it actually it's just they use a different app but they use it for exactly the same reasons?
Like, to answer a part of the question, like I think it's part of the debate within like tech leaders in China, like AI leaders in China, whether the older model for the social media platforms, and which is really about eyeballs, right? Really about the amount of time you spend in front of the app, and which is why WeChat exists, right? Like everything's on there, and so you can just do everything there, and that's one model, and then the other model that folks are more interested in is the 实体经济, like the physical economy. Like, how do you use these technologies, work with different sectors, medical, coal mining, judicial system, or autonomous vehicles? How do you make sure that you are fine-tuning a model, based on the data that they have, and actually bring about productivity gains for these sectors? I think this part of the development is of great interest to the government. And so you see different initiatives in support of that. The Beijing government has put out quite a few plans that support developments in this area. And one way for them to do this well is like have a regulatory sandbox, have pilot zones where companies can experiment. And if things go slightly wrong with the contained space, they can iterate and make it better and contain the risk as well. So one side of it that I think is very interesting is the 实体经济, like kind of like merging AI and having AI be the basis of these manufacturing sectors and all that is really interesting. One thing of interest is also how will AI in China be greener than the rest of the world, because China also has its emissions goal and all of that. And also because of the lack of advanced chips, I think they're very interested in compute efficiency and things like that. But again, that might be going back to our previous topic. And I'd love to actually hear from you guys more about applications that you've seen that are interesting as well.
Yeah, I have been thinking about this, and I find it interesting actually that if you visit China as someone who's from anywhere else, to be honest, and you walk in and you see the way in which technology is integrated in absolutely everything that people do, I don't think there's anywhere like it. I don't think there's anywhere that has that same kind of level. And yet at the same time, my feeling on AI is, it's been adopted in a different way, is the things that have become a part of your life without even knowing it. So, the algorithms that feed delivery apps, and the way in which it's become embedded in your life in a way that everyone's going to see this, but without even knowing it's AI. That has definitely happened in China ahead of anywhere else. And even uses like I've given on this podcast, examples of kind of medical uses where, I had a photo taken of my eyes and it gave me a load of stuff. For people who are not aware, like in China, if you've got a job, you basically get a yearly health check. And there were two parts of the health check that I had last year that were, one was an eye test, the other one was a kind of ECG, but you wore a little thing for 30 minutes and then it declared it to be an AI. I'm not really sure why it was AI. I think it may have just been, an example of how you call something AI because that makes it sound more interesting. But it's definitely integrated in a way in which I've not seen elsewhere. On the other hand, I think that, although there are kind of apps out there, and maybe I'm overestimating the use in the UK, in the US, in sort of Europe, Western countries in inverted commas, but most of my friends, even here, who are, British, they have ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and they're constantly using it on their phones. I don't see that in the same way with Chinese friends. Most of them have got some access, but they're not using it in quite the same way. And I wonder whether that is about the fact that, I've said quite a few times, I have Tongyi on my phone, the reason I have Tongyi on my phone is because I don't have to, jump the firewall to use it. So sometimes it's just more convenient. But the other day I asked it a question. My daughter had an extra tooth come in at the back. And I was like, is that normal? So I asked Tongyi, and Tongyi told me, no, this is abnormal. This is what's called a something tooth, and you should go to the doctors. I asked Claude, and Claude said, yes, how old are you? At 5 to 6 years old, this is normal. This is the first of her permanent teeth that comes in at the back. And so what we've talked about before in terms of the development of kind of frontier models is that China's, up there, and Q1 is a really great model. But the kind of consumer-facing app and the consumer-facing interface, just for me, it's just not quite there. And so I don't know whether it's, people have had that experience and so they're not getting as good a use out of it, or if it's just a case of, they think that Chinese models are not as good and so they're actually using ChatGPT but they don't tell anybody about it. I'm not sure, but I don't get the idea that it's integrated in people's personal lives here quite as much as it has of certainly my experience of kind of friends in the US, the UK, in Europe. However, on the other hand, like I say, in terms of practical uses and integrated with business and with jobs and with your day-to-day life, I think it's ahead. So it's interesting because it's not better or worse, it's just different. I mean, Jimmy, I don't know what your personal experience is.
Well, I kind of think, first of all, it's a bit of a third option where I think the number of people that are actually using ChatGPT or something like that every day is probably still not that high. As a
anywhere, you mean?
Anywhere, yeah, anywhere. Like, I think more people have been exposed to AI through the fact that it's now built into Google, it's built into Bing, it's built into common search engines, so you're just using it, but you almost don't really realise you're using it. First of all, I think that's my first point. Second thing, in China, like, one of the things I have noticed is AI labeling content as AI seems to be ahead of the West. So, for example, on QQ Music, which is like a music app like Spotify, there's actually a separate tab for AI-generated music. And so it's there, but you can click on the AI tab. It's clearly labeled, and you can just play AI generated music if you want.
Whereas on Spotify, it's just
On
hidden
Spotify-
amongst everything else.
Yeah, we talked about it on
Yeah.
that episode with Ants, the music episode. But like on Spotify, I'm pretty sure there's loads of AI music on there, but it's not really labeled as such. And there's the same thing with like your like with again like channels, which is similar to TikTok. There's stuff on there that's AI, and it's clearly labeled AI generated content. Fictional AI generated content, I think, is the label they use. So I think in labeling they're a bit further ahead. I think in terms of like pure chat experience, I'm actually not sure about the Chinese search engines, but I think the way most people will become exposed to AI is through that natural integration into search engines, rather than I'm going to specifically use an AI to do whatever, like to talk to ChatGPT or Claude. I think that's still a relatively limited amount of people.
Yeah, I think part of the difficulty here for like in the China case is they need to get people to want to use their models, right? And I think now it's starting to change, but maybe a few months back, why would you use like why would you pay to use like Baidu Wenxing perhaps when you can use like a ChatGPT API for free or for not a lot of money? And so them attracting, these companies that have spent so much on developing these models actually have been found to be paying a lot of money to attract to market and attract more customers. Moonshot and Baichuan are two of the ones spending a lot of money on this. And so I think we're still in this process where they're convincing the users to get used to the system and to build that stickiness with the user base. But I think for the longer duration of the past year and a bit, it's these companies have been more focused on the B2B, which is where they can actually get some money for all the money that they've spent to build these models. Yeah, and I also think that kind of just chimes with the official stamp of approval and the governmental interest in the physical economy. So it's easy. But I also, sorry.
No, that's something I was going to say was this point around you separating out the real economy and things that have a commercial benefit. If you, and when I say you, I'm talking to I'm talking to all of our listeners here. If you think about the way in which a sort of an application that wants to be consumer facing, or a company that has an app they want to be consumer facing, you think about the steps that they will have to go through to make that kind of viable in terms of matching with the political goals and the need for stability and to protect from potential social harms. The cost of doing that to do business is huge, because if it goes wrong, and you've invested all that money and then they just shut you down. Whereas if you've got those commercial things, that certainly the door's been okay. Well, if you can show me that this is going to benefit the real economy, we're willing to be a lot more flexible and a lot more loose with you. I think if you think about the consumer facing, and I'll give an example from my own experience of when you're using a sort of consumer-facing large language model in China, and you ask it a question about something that is not particularly sensitive. So the Summer Palace, the old Summer Palace in Beijing, which was burnt down by the Brits and the French, that in itself, I guess, is sensitive. But the fact that it happened is not sensitive, because it's it's proof that China was kind of wronged. If you ask a question in English about the old Summer Palace, that's just asking anything about the Summer Palace, it begins to answer the question, then it shuts itself down. So the guardrails that have been put on are just such that, well, hang on, why have they guardrailed that? Well, you need to understand that because it's just easier to guardrail anything that might be even slightly sensitive than to try and have a kind of really nuanced approach and work out what might get us past the sensors and not. So the amount of investment that you need to put, and the amount of time and the amount of questions that you need to answer and that you need to show that have been, blocked or have been harmonized in such a way as it will get through the censorship, when you don't need to do the same, is my understanding, when there is a commercial use. So you can definitely see why there would be more of a focus on that side of it. Now, don't get me wrong, I think in the US as well, that's where the money's to be made. So, of course, that's where the focus will be for everybody. But I think in China, it's such a price to pay and such a risk in a consumer-facing model that I think that has a huge influence on how they develop.
I think that that's definitely true to a certain extent. And then we also see companies that are getting more involved in the B2C side. So I think Jupu is one of them. Other companies have also been doing that more. And you also have companies like Moonshot that are very clearly very committed to a proprietary model that is B2C only, primarily B2C. And I think one of the reasons for that, and the governments would also be cautious and kind of overstepping here, because when you expand your user base, you're also collecting a lot of useful data. People are using it for work, for example. And I think some of the cases that Jupu or another company found is that some of the B2C customers recommended the company to start using Jupu's products, and therefore led to a company adoption. And I think that's interesting as well. And I think the government's role here is really trying to toe the line of making sure that what it cares about, the political control side, is still there, and still people understand that. And I think they did it very clearly with the interim measures, AIGC interim measures from last year, from last April, but also show a little bit of flexibility as to the needs of the industry. For example, that led to them like deleting one of the clauses that asks for complete accuracy of the models and what they generate, because it simply will not work for the needs of the industry. And China needs its industry to work as well as it can so as to compete. Because the center of innovation is not the government. The center of innovation is the private sector and what the government can do in support of that. Yeah.
Would you mind, sorry, on that? Would you mind elaborating a little bit? It sounds like it's something that the government tried to put in place, where it was like the model needs to be like 100% accurate all the time.
Yeah. So in the interim measures from last year, so it was put out in April, and it collected information and kind of changed some of the clauses and was implemented in August. So what it did is essentially ask the developers of the models, the service providers and the users, to make sure that they are also meeting the socialist standards of the country, i.e., whatever censorship or whatever expectations we have of you guys when you're doing public-facing stuff and you have a public-facing platform or app that can really influence public opinions, you should be careful of not touching the red lines. So I think that document was very clarifying. I know that some folks have thought that that would stop Chinese industry from moving ahead with their products and all that. I don't think that's the case, as much as it's a kind of communication between the industry and the government. This is the expectation. Make sure you keep the expectations that we had of you guys from before in this new era of Gen AI, essentially. And what's interesting also is coming on the heels of that document, the interim measures for AIGC, we also have the Politburo emphasizing that they're interested in AI's development, innovation, and governance, or risk prevention. So I think that was really the strongest statement from the government discussing Gen AI, and they decided to put the focus on the dual goals around the technology.
Yeah, I think this is like really interesting. It's one of those things where I guess if you're not familiar with China, like many of our listeners probably won't be, then you wouldn't expect the country to be so progressive given their like you say, socialist values. And so, because essentially what you're saying there is like, well, AIs hallucinate. We can't really do anything about that, so we need to let them hallucinate a little bit.
And so the blunt way to make sure that it also toes political line is, you get rid of certain terms, right? Like you try to get your model not to mention those terms. Yeah. The price of doing business.
Price of doing business, indeed. So we will stop part 1 there. We will come back with the second part of that interview, probably in a couple of weeks' time. Between now and then, we've got at least one other thing that we're going to put out. So do stay tuned in. If you enjoyed it or you didn't enjoy it, give us some feedback. Pass it on to your friends and enjoy our outro song. See you next week. Take care.
Chips and supply chains driving tech ahead. Innovation in China, the world must be led. Not about who's on top, but how we all can grow. Governance for high quality benefits to bestow. This AI arms race, it's not China versus USA. We need global solutions, a world that works our way. Innovation for all, not just a limited few. Governance to ensure progress that's fair and true. Restrict access, it won't stop their stride. Unlock potential, let the whole world thrive. Not about blocking, but elevating all. United we stand, heed progress, global call. This AI arms race, it's not China versus USA. We need global solutions, a world that works our way. Innovation for all, not just a limited few. Governance to ensure progress that's fair and true. Restrict access, it won't stop their stride. Unlock potential, let the whole world thrive. Not about blocking, but elevating all. United we stand, heed progress, global call. This AI arms race, it's not China versus USA. We need global solutions, a world that works our way. Innovation for all, not just a limited few. Governance to ensure progress that's fair and true. Chip supply and more, drivers of the future. Cooperation, not cutthroat, competition's the suture. Unlock the potential, govern with care. Prosperity for all is what we should prepare. This AI arms race, it's not China versus USA. We need global solutions, a world that works our way. Innovation for all, not just a limited few. Governance to ensure progress that's fair and true.